Fire in the Minds of Men, Origins of the Revolutionary Faith by James H. Billington. Book 1. Foundations of the Revolutionary Faith, the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The city is the crucible of modern revolution. The revolutionary tradition seen from below is a narrative of urban unrest successfully dominated by Paris and St. Petersburg. Paris overthrew the mightiest monarchy in Christendom in 1789 through 92, triggered new waves of revolution in 1830 and 1848, and forged a new model for social revolution in the Paris Commune of 1871. By then, there had arisen in St. Petersburg a new type of revolutionary who was to convulse the largest land empire in the world with terror in the late 19th century and insurrection in the early 20th. Three Russian revolutions in 1905, March 1917, and November 1917 brought the revolutionary tradition out of the wilderness and into power. Other cities also played decisive roles. Strasbourg, where German ideas entered France and the national revolutionary ideal burst into the song with the 1790s. Lyon, where class warfare first fueled the rival social revolutionary traditions in the 1830s, and Berlin, where Marx was first radicalized and where a Marxist revolution failed in 1918 through 19, dooming the communist cause to confinement in Russia for the next 30 years. The site of legitimacy was not revolutionary St. Petersburg, which took the new name Leningrad from the victorious leader. It was the medieval Kremlin within conservative Moscow. Seen from above, the revolutionary tradition is a story of elites, intellectual leaders, a thin line of apostolic succession from Buonarroti to Lenin. The former was the leading survivor and historian of the first organization for secular social revolution, the Babeuf conspiracy of 1796 through 97. Like St. Petersburg among the Romans, Filippo Buonarroti was the rock on which subsequent revolutionaries built. By the time of his death in 1837, social revolutionary leadership had passed to his admirer Louis Auguste Blanqui, who retained special authority throughout the Paris-dominated era. Leadership moved from Paris to St. Petersburg through Blanqui's Russian collaborator Peter Tchaikovsky. His compatriots assassinated the Russian Tsar in St. Petersburg in 1881, the year Blanqui died in Paris. When Lenin's older brother was hanged 6 years later for plotting to kill the next Tsar, young Lenin became the vehicle for vengeance and vindication. Lenin's path from an underground cell to the podium of power began in a particular place in St. Petersburg, the student-run dining hall and library of the St. Petersburg Technological Institute. The revolutionary seed first took root in the early 1890s, in this spot where the young Lenin had his first contact both with the main Marxist classics and with real industrial workers. Within this small era of freedom, students not only dreamed of a technologically abundant alternative to Tsarism, but also used their technical talents to form the first Russian organization of revolutionary Marxists. The road that was to lead from the Technological Institute to the Finland station originated, however, earlier and elsewhere. The first green zone that fertilized the revolutionary seed by turning intellectuals into revolutionaries was the Palais Royal in the late 1780s. This privileged Parisian sanctuary of the reformist House of Orléans incubated those who wrestled power from the ruling royal palace of Versailles in 1789 and from the Tuileries in 1792. Long before the Leninists occupied the Winter Palace in 1917. Thus, our story begins with the Anti-Versailles in the heart of Paris, the scene of the first modern revolution. It leads us to Buonarroti, the anti-Napoleon who conceived of the first modern revolutionary organization. Chapter 1: Incarnation. The modern revolutionary tradition begins with both word and deed, prophecy and incarnation. First came the slow growth of the idea of secular revolution in early modern Europe. Then came the fact of a totally new kind of upheaval within the largest city of the mightiest power in Europe. The idea of revolution. Long before the second coming of 1917 and even before the incarnation of 1789, men brooded about the nature and meaning of the word revolution. The term derives from the Latin substantive revolutio, word which was unknown in classical Latin, but was used in the early Middle Ages by Saint Augustine and other Christian writers, translated into Italian as rivoluzione in the early Renaissance, and then into French and English as revolution. The term initially meant to the return of a moving object to its place of origin, particularly the movements of celestial bodies around the Earth. Copernicans used it increasingly in the 16th and 17th centuries to describe their unsettling new concept of the Earth revolving axially and orbitally around the Sun. The French savant Jacques Amiot suggested that in 16th century France, an understanding of these awesome movements in nature was also necessary for a successful politician. Il y a une certaine révolution et préfixion de temps, outre que l'homme sage ne doit plus émettre des affaires de la chose politique. But revolutionary change was still generally seen as a return to an earlier, temporarily violated norm, a revolution back to a more natural order. Even the extremists of the 17th and 18th centuries who helped prepare revolution tended to think of restoring pre-existing rights and traditions. Judeo-Christian ideas inspired what many considered the first modern revolutions, the Puritan rebellion in the 17th century England, and non-conformist religious ideas played a major role in preparing the American Revolution. Fanatical religious ideologies dominated the 16th century civil wars and that raged within the two great continental powers, the Habsburg Empire and the French Kingdom. Both sides in both of these conflicts have recently been hailed as revolutionary pioneers. The Dutch revolt against authoritarian Spain has been called the first modern revolution and the earliest modern expression of democratic ideas. Similar claims have also been made for an earlier revolt in which the roles were reversed when urban Spaniards rebelled against the predominantly Dutch entourage of Charles V. A leading Calvinist in 16th century France was one of the first modern revolutionaries, as was his Bête Noire, the Catholic League, which installed the first revolutionary reign of terror that Paris was to experience. These Parisian Catholics were probably the most authentic anticipation of modern revolutionaries. They introduced the term Committee of Public Safety, the use of barricades, and a program that was truly revolutionary in the sense that it embodied conscious social antagonisms. But such revolutionary means still served reactionary ends. Innovative political practices continue to require aggressively Christian ideologies. The grounds for a new approach were prepared by the exhaustion which religious conflict and by the enthusiasm over the scientific method that produced a crisis of the European consciousness at the end of the 17th century. In the ensuing enlightenment of the 18th century, a critical spirit began to regard Greco-Roman antiquity as a kind of secular alternative to Christianity. Much of the growing volume of secular political writing in the age of the Enlightenment dealt with the problem of revolution. A pioneering Italian work of 1629 on the causes and prevention of revolution found kingdoms particularly vulnerable to revolution because of their monarch's misconduct. An anti-Spanish treatise, The Revolutions in Naples, appeared in 1647 on the eve of an uprising in Naples led by the fisherman Masciaello against the Habsburg. This event stimulated the already well-developed Italian discussion of political revolution. Polemic writers in England during the Puritan Revolution drew in turn on Italian writings. One English work on the Neapolitan uprising coined the classic revolutionary metaphor of a fire coming from a small spark. The poet Robert Heath appears to have been the first to link political revolution with social change, speaking of a strange vertigo or delirium of the brain, drawing England into a revolution that went beyond politics. Nor doth the state alone on fortune's wheels run round, alas, our rock religion reels. He then suggests that the hope of heaven on earth might replace the heaven above. Amidst these turnings, 'tis some comfort yet. Heaven doth not fly from us, though we from it. And finally comes the full new fantasy. Nothing but fine utopian worlds. I, the moon, must be new formed by revolution. Interests in the upheaval which restored moderate monarchy to England in 1688 led to a proliferation of anonymous historical studies in which the term Glorious Revolution was introduced to the continent. In the New World, as in the Old, revolution became for the first time a positive political ideal. The most dynamic of the enlightened despots, Frederick the Great, saw revolutions as part of the destiny of nations, particularly new ones. In 1751, he wrote that fragility and instability are inseparable from the works of men. The revolutions that monarchies and republics experience have their causes in the immutable laws of nature. Frederick generally used the word revolution in the old sense of revolving back to where nations had been before, but he also began the trend among German thinkers of applying the word to spiritual as well as political change. He said of the Lutheran Reformation, "A revolution so great and so singular that which changed almost the entire system of Europe deserves to be examined with philosophical eyes." Later, Germans such as Hegel and Marx, of course, to use just such philosophical eyes to see in the liberating reforms of both Lutheran and Frederick antecedents of the modern ideological-based revolutionary tradition. Frederick the Great's interest in revolution as a spiritual and political event subtly influenced many Germans of his time. He created in Prussia a sense of a new Promethean possibilities. His impatience with the tradition in affairs of state was echoed in the Republic of Letters by the rebellious poet of the Sturm und Drang, radical Bavarian Illuminists, urged in the early 1780s that his secularizing reforms be carried even further through an imminent revolution of human mind. Their opponents, in turn, already saw in such a program in 1786 the threat of an imminent universal revolution. Thus Germany, not France, gave birth to the sweeping modern idea of revolution as a secular upheaval, more universal in range and more transforming in scope than any purely political change. The concept was transported to Paris by Count Mirabeau, a former French ambassador in Berlin. It helped him to become the leading figure in the early events of the French Revolution in 1789. His study of Frederick the Great in 1788 had proclaimed Prussia the likely site of a coming revolution, and the German Illuminists, its probable leaders. Mirabeau's speech and writings the following year transferred these expectations of a deep transformation from Germany to France. He became both the leader in turning the Third Estate of the Estates General into a new National Assembly and the first to succeed in launching a journal without the authorization of the government. His reputation as the outstanding orator of the Assembly is closely related to his pioneering role in convincing the French that their revolution, though political in form, was redemptive in contents. Mirabeau popularized the Illuminist term revolution of the mind, introduced the phrase Great Revolution, and apparently invented the words revolutionary, counter-revolution, and counter-revolutionary. Mirabeau pioneered in applying the evocative language of traditional religion to the new political institutions of revolutionary France. As early as May 10, 1789, he wrote to the constituents who had elected him to the Third Estate that the purpose of the General States was not to reform but to regenerate the nation. He subsequently called the National Assembly the inviolable priesthood of national policy, the Declaration of the Rights of Man a political gospel, and the Constitution of 1791 a new religion for which the people are ready to die. The introduction of a hitherto little used word revolution into the German language sealed the new and quasi-religious usage of the word. Writers and lexicographers initially either bragged or complained, according to their politics, that we Germans wish so hard to keep revolution distant that we do not have even one word for it in our vocabulary. And the French word was introduced into German precisely to convey in its nature an impossible movement with speed and quickness, to inspire awe and suggest a novelty beyond the traditional word for political upheaval. Umwälzung. We shall return to this faith in revolution as something totally new, secular and regenerative, and to the occult, Germanic sources of this idea. But first we must briefly consider the events of the French Revolution themselves, for the convulsions that began in Paris in 1789 represented an unprecedented succession of novelties that made Mirabeau's new concept of revolution believable. With mounting intensity, and without any clear plan or continuous leadership, France proceeded to create a new political lexicon centered on the word democracy and on a new understanding of revolution as a superhuman source of fresh dynamism for human history. The fact of revolution. In the summer of 1789, absolute monarchy and aristocratic authority were overthrown forever in the most powerful kingdom in Christendom. This was the essential French Revolution, the hard fact that gave birth to the modern belief that secular revolution is historically possible. This unplanned political transformation occurred within a period of exactly 5 months, between May 5th, when King Louis XVI opened in Versailles the first Estates General to meet in 175 years, and October 5th, when the king was brought back to Paris as a virtual prisoner of the mob. The decisive event of these 5 months was the Third Estate, which represented everyone except the clergy and nobility and was dominated by articular middle-class lawyers, declaring itself to be the National Assembly. Members of the two estates went over to join the Third Estate. It resolved in the Tennis Court Oath of June 20th to remain in being until the constitution of the realm is set up and consolidated on firm foundations. Following the violence in Paris that led to the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, a great fear spread through the countryside. Fires destroyed many records and symbols of the manorial system. In the course of August, the Assembly abolished serfdom and aristocratic privilege and proclaimed the natural and imprescriptible right of every citizen to liberty, equality, property, and security. News of a political act, the king's dismissal of his reformist finance minister Necker, had firmed the original unrest in Paris. 9 days after the Bastille fell in Paris, mob hung Necker's successor. A political authority was restored by the Marquis de Lafayette. He arrived on the white horse, literally as well as symbolically, took military command of Paris on July 15th, leading legitimacy to upheaval and serving with Mirabeau as a founding father of the revolutionary tradition. Wounded at age 19 while fighting for American independence in the Battle of Brandywine, Lafayette had returned to France hoping that the American Revolution might serve as a lesson to the oppressors and as an example to the oppressed in the Old World. He presented a key to the Bastille to Washington, used American rhetoric to help draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and lent dignity as head of the new National Guard to the fateful march on Versailles on October 5th. Yet this seeming guarantor of continuing order amidst revolutionary change was soon denounced not by the right but by the left as well. Burke's conservative attack on the French Revolution listed Lafayettism first among the rabble of systems. On the revolutionary side, Gracchus Babeuf, just a year after the fall of the Bastille, excoriated Lafayette as a conceited and anti-democratic break on the revolutionary process. Later revolutionaries, as well as we shall see, repeatedly raged against him. Mirabeau, also a marquis but less elegant than Lafayette, was more central to the early revolutionary events. Rejected by his fellow aristocrats for election to the Estate General, and pockmarked, Mirabeau accepted election by the Third Estate. He infused it with la passion politique, The constitutional monarchy favored by Lafayette and Mirabeau could not survive the attempt of the king to flee Paris in the summer of 1791 and the outbreak of foreign war in the spring of 1792. Revolutionary France formally proclaimed a republic in August 1792, massacred 1,100 alleged domestic foes in Paris in September, and publicly guillotined King Louis XVI in January 1793. External and internal violence increasingly polarized politics and split the National Assembly into the original right and left. The subsequent equation of the left with virtue dramatized revolution in defiance of Christian tradition, which had always represented those on the right hand of God as saved and those on the left as damned. During this time, the armed masses in Paris tended increasingly to reject the politics of the Assembly, arguing that le côté droit est toujours gauche, et le gauche n'est jamais droit. The crowd that had invaded the Tuileries Palace to imprison the king on August 10, 1792, broke into the assembly on May 31, 1793, and in the summer mobilized in the Levée en Masse to resist counter-revolutionary foes in the countryside and on the borders. The subsequent history of the armed revolution reveals a seemingly irresistible drive towards a strong central executive. Robespierre's 12-man Committee of Public Safety, 1793-94, gave way to a 5-man dictatorate, 1795-99, to a 3-man consulate, to the designation of Napoleon as first consul in 1799, and finally to Napoleon's coronation as emperor in 1804. After 1792, a growing split developed between the started ideals of the Revolutionary Republic and their practical implementation. Marxists have represented this conflict as the inevitable clash of the proletarian quest for a social revolution and the bourgeois desire to consolidate newly acquired property rights and political power. But social consciousness at that time was focused on the shared hatred of foreigners and aristocrats, and in pre-industrial Paris the distinction between the working and middle classes was not yet clear. The more significant split was between the political consciousness of the articulate lawyers and leaders of the revolutionary France and the mundane, apolitical demands of the urban masses for food, security, and something to believe in. The leaders repeatedly failed to satisfy the Parisian populace. Lafayette, who in April 1792 had favored war in order to rally France behind the constitutional monarchy, was soon drowned out by the more bellicose and radical Brissot. The Brissotistes, or Girondists, were in turn swept aside by the more extreme Jacobins. In the late spring of 1793, the relatively moderate Jacobinism of Danton was then supplemented by Robespierre. His reign of terror claimed some 40,000 domestic victims in 1793 through 94, yet none of these figures was able to bring stability. Robespierre, the most radical political leader of the revolutionary era, was also the first to turn decisively against the Paris mob. He broke up his sectional assemblies in the fall of 1793 and executed the extreme enragés or Iberistes in the spring of 1794, shortly before he too was guillotined in July. The retrenchments that followed the so-called Thermidorian reaction checked a seemingly inexorable drift to the left. The new Republican Constitution of 1795 was far less radical than that written in 1793, but never put in effect. 2 years later, the attempt of the Babeuf conspiracy to organize a new revolutionary uprising was crushed by the 5-man dictatorship with no difficulty. Though Napoleon rose to power through the Revolutionary Army and used revolutionary ideas to expand French power, he, like the constitutional monarchs who were restored to power after him, was generally seen not as an heir to the revolution, but as its repudiator. The revolutionary tradition reached maturity when fighting broke out again in the streets of Paris against the restored Bourbons in July 1830. Lafayette, by then an old man, emerged to legitimize a return to constitutional monarchy and helped establish in power Louis Philippe of the House of Orléans. The linkage was deeply appropriate, for the original revolution of 1789 that had been led by Lafayette can in a sense be said to have begun in the Parisian pleasure dome of Louis Philippe's father, Philippe of Orléans, the Palais Royal. There, in the shadow of the Tuileries Palace, Philippe had decided to accept the revolution and rename himself Égalité rather than remain loyal to his cousin King Louis XVI. It was this Philippe who renamed a great public gardens of the Palais Royal, in which the mob that stormed the Bastille first formed, the Garden of Equality. And it is in the revolutionary Garden of Eden, this unlikely Bethlehem, that the story of the revolutionary faith properly begins.